Hi everybody, welcome to the fourth conference run by the Floodplain Meadows Partnership. This is, however, our first online conference, so please forgive us any technical hitches. I'm sure you're all used to those by now. For those that don't know me, my name is Emma Rothrow. I'm the Floodplain Meadows Partnership Manager, and I'm chairing this session. We have support on the chat today from Olivia Nelson and Claire Lawson from the FMP team, and we have support in managing the presentations and Teams IT from the very wonderful Babette, Oliver and Amy Sharp from the Events Management and OU Comms teams, without whom none of this would be possible. And they will continue to support us over the next 3 days. This is a really exciting time for the Floodplain Meadows Partnership. We're becoming more recognised externally with the Ecover and Green Recovery bid. We have an online exhibition at COP26 and have been working with the BBC on Countryfile's Plant Britain. There is lots of policy development relevant to our objectives across agriculture, nature recovery strategies, climate change mitigation and adaptation. We're looking for ways the partnership and Floodplain Meadows can respond to the twin challenges of biodiversity and climate change crises. We hope this conference will move us further down this path and that you find inspiration, guidance, chat and discussion. We've tried to build in a range of different ways to share information over these 3 days, including presentations, polls, discussion, virtual site visits and a Floodplain Meadows question type approach this evening and tomorrow evening. There are some questions for that session that have been submitted to the panel for those sessions, and we'll be talking about those. But as we go through the conference, please do think of other questions you may want to bring to the panel who are experts in all things Floodplain Meadow. It's a great opportunity to have feedback and discussion. In terms of ground rules for how we're going to run the conference, you can't activate your own video or microphone, I'm afraid. If you want to ask a question in the question and answer sessions, please raise your virtual hand and you'll be invited to speak by the chair of the session, and then you'll be unmuted. Cameras will remain disabled. But please do use the chat. We'll be monitoring this and we'll try and pick up questions as we go, which can be asked in the Q&A sessions or in the question time sessions later on. You'll be able to access the chat after the event as long as you have the event in your calendar or have attended a session. We are recording all the sessions and these will be made available at some point afterwards, but please be patient. We do need to edit them first. And finally, and really excitingly, we are announcing the winners of our arts and crafts competition on Friday in the last session. This has been a really exciting project for us and we have been amazed by the number and range of the entries. Olivia Nelson will be telling you all about the competition and the winner Friday. So we can move on to our fantastic keynote speakers. I don't think we have yet Barry Gardner in the room. Barry, can you put your hand up if you're there? I don't think he is there. So if not, I'm going to move straight on to Trini Christiansen, if that's okay. Trini is the project manager at the European Environment Agency and author of the report published in 2019 called Floodplains, a Natural System to Preserve and Restore. And we really wanted to hear a European perspective on floodplain management. So over to Trini. Thank you very much.
So good, I guess it's good evening now, at least in my part of Europe. It's a little before 6, so I'm a little after you in the time zones. Anyway, I'm Trini Christiansen. I'm from the European Environment Agency, and I'm here to talk about river and wetland restoration from a European perspective. Years ago, we did an analysis of the second river basin management plans from that are reported under the Water Framework Directive. And one of the key results from this work was the map that I show here, where you can see all the red areas are areas where more than 50% of water bodies are not achieving good ecological status. And what also came from this work is that one of the most widespread pressures responsible for this are the pressures that are associated with hydromorphology. So, and this is about a third of water bodies that are impacted by hydromorphology, according to these reports from the legislative process of the Water Framework Directive. If we at the results, if we look at the results coming from the Habitats Directive for rivers, lakes, alluvial and riparian habitats, see a similar third of those habitats that are impacted by hydromorphology. So there's absolutely no question that this is a very important pressure in our aquatic systems. And when we talk about hydromorphology, what we're actually talking about is river continuity or connectivity. So the connection between the upstream part of the river and the downstream part of the river, as well as the connection between the main channel and the riparian area. And as I'm sure you're, sorry, I was being distracted by the chat. And as I'm sure you know, the barriers to this connectivity, they have a lot to do with either the longitudinal barriers, of which there are millions in Europe, or channel stabilization, flood protection, or drainage of the riparian area. And all of this, as you know, all of these pressures are extremely widespread, and they are very much part of deteriorating the environmental quality of our rivers. At the agency, we did an analysis of floodplain condition where we calculated two different indicators of lateral connectivity. One was an assessment of habitat area loss, so deviation from what might be a natural setting, and the other is a land use pressure indicator. And in combination, these indicators suggest that somewhere between 80 and 90% of the lateral connectivity in the floodplains are substantially to severely degraded. And when we then look at the results coming in of assessments of under the Habitats Directive of floodplain habitats, we see that only 17% of these habitats are in favorable conservation status, so basically confirming the sad state of affairs in the riparian zone. So it's a good thing that we today have the biodiversity strategy towards 2030, which has a target for rivers, and the way that this target is articulated is to restore at least 25,000 kilometers of rivers into free flowing by removing barriers and by restoration of floodplains and wetlands. And here I'd like to qualify that this free flowing means without both longitudinal and lateral barriers, and also that the time horizon it goes beyond 2030, because in parallel to the biodiversity strategy, there's a target, there's a new nature restoration law coming in, which aims to set legally binding targets towards 2050. And of course, a lot of what we do at the EA is associated with monitoring progress towards this, but it's still very early days. So at the moment, we're talking a lot about it, but we have little to show. So the role of the EU nature restoration law is complementary to the biodiversity strategy. So the strategy targets the need to restore and the objective to restore, but the nature restoration law is expected, so it's not been published yet, but we're expecting it to say something about what needs to be restored. So what is it we're trying to achieve with this restoration in terms of ecosystem services? And in particular, habitat area improvement, the carbon storage potential that was also discussed in the film now, and disaster risk reductions are factors that are coming in very heavily with this new legal instrument. But what we're also seeing at the agency is one thing is having these ambitions, but another thing is being able to actually monitor progress towards these targets and to set baselines. And there's no question that this really also drives the demand for new data sets at the European scale, where, for example, a product like the EU Hydro, which is a consistent and topologically connected river network, is going to be very important. We're working towards developing a high-resolution habitats map. The current reporting under the Habitats Directive is the data set that gives the European overview at the moment, and this is a 10 by 10 kilometer grid, so very high resolution, and we need a very low resolution, and we need something with a much higher resolution. And then we have the whole discussion around the lateral barriers. How do we create an inventory of it? Because if we're going to assess the lateral connectivity improvements, we really need to understand what it is that needs to be removed. And we see this as a project that would be very much complementary to what has already been developed as part of the Amber Atlas, where the transversal barriers in Europe's networks has been mapped. And then I think I'd just like to say that, at least from a policy perspective, there's no question that our greenhouse gas emission reduction ambition is a very strong driver. Is a very strong driver of future both restoration but also trade-offs in the river. So, for example, hydropower is probably going to be something that some countries will want to push for as part of their emission reductions, but then in other countries, the greenhouse gas retentions in the riparian zone and also the natural water retention measures to achieve the disaster risk reduction is something that will drive developments there. In Denmark, which is where I am, we are setting aside 4% of the national territory as low-lying areas that we plan to maintain as wet to simply keep the carbon in the ground as part of achieving our emission targets. So with this, I just want to thank you very much for listening, and I wish you a very good few days with your conference. I think you have a very interesting agenda ahead of you, and I hope you have a wonderful time. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Trini, and really well done for speaking slightly ahead of where you were expecting to. So I'm going to move straight on to introduce Barry Gardiner, MP, Labour MP for Brent North. Barry currently serves as a member of two select committees, the Environmental Audit Select Committee and the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs Select Committee. He also chairs the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Nature and the All-Party Parliamentary Group for International Conservation. And we are absolutely delighted that he's able to come and talk to us today. Thank you very much, Barry.
Emma, thanks. In fact, I've just come from one of those select committees where we were grilling the 6 chief executives of the water companies. And I'm sure that that session may well be of interest to some of your members as well. Look, scaling up restoration of the UK's natural ecosystems for the benefit of the planet, for biodiversity, it could not be more pressing. And Dasgupta made clear that this is an issue of asset management, or rather, it's actually a failure of asset management that's led this country to being one of the worst nature-depleted countries in the world. As chair, as you said, of the All-Party Group for Nature, obviously I take a particular interest in nature-based solutions to climate change. But while the climate crisis has really gripped public consciousness, the crisis in biodiversity and ecosystem decline has really not got the same focus from the public, or indeed, I think, from government. Only 2% of our UK grasslands remain species rich. And since the end of the last World War, we've lost 97% of our meadows and grasslands. Now, that's an absolutely staggering figure. 75% of the remaining meadows are so small that actually they then have significantly reduced biodiversity. So it's not surprising that the latest State of Nature report highlights that 15% of species are threatened with extinction from the UK, and 41% have decreased since 1970. If we're not committed to protecting our domestic natural environments, then, how do we expect to command respect on the world stage in a few weeks' time at COP26? So as we look towards the COP, we do need an urgent prioritization of nature-based solutions from governments. And I know it's going to be one of the themes there in Glasgow, but at present, only 3% of global climate finance is spent on nature-based solutions, and only 1% goes for adaptation. We need to ramp up ambition and action, as we also have, of course, the COP15 negotiations underway, where we'll agree a new post-2020 biodiversity framework. And, I'm afraid the reality is that we don't have a strong foundation to build on. In the UK, we failed on 17 out of the 20 AHE targets that were set in 2010 at the CBD in Nagoya. And if we needed a further reminder, today the Environment Agency's third adaptation report warns us that we risk underfunding adaptation measures at our peril. Their chief executive likens choosing mitigation over adaptation to telling a bird it only needs to fly on one wing. The pandemic has highlighted to many the importance of our natural landscapes. Recent flooding over the summer shows that it's really important that we recognize the importance of our natural landscapes, such as floodplain, grasslands and meadows, in reducing flooding risks, as well as their ecosystem services and the carbon sequestration potential that they have. So let's go a little deeper into some of the key benefits of restoring our natural environment, which serve as a reminder of the importance of this conference that we're holding. First, as economic and job creation. And I think it's really important that the RSPB study into the potential for nature restoration as part of the UK's post-COVID recovery said that we could generate £6.4 billion a year. They pointed out that every pound invested in salt marsh, in peatlands, grasslands and woodland restoration could actually return £3 on average. Now, that's an economic benefit that we really do need. But funding for conservation, sadly, has fallen by 42% since 2000. So the government's levelling up agenda came into the spotlight recently, you may recall, at the party conference that the Conservative government held. And job creation, I think, really has to be central in any thoughts about levelling up. A focus on the Environmental Audit Committee's recent inquiry into greening the COVID recovery and biodiversity specifically highlighted the job creation potential from restoring our natural environments. If the government aims to deliver on its ambition in the 25-year environment plan of restoring 500,000 hectares of habitat, that could actually lead to over 15,000 jobs. In the immediate term, Wildlife and Countryside Link estimate that there are over 300 ready-to-go projects which could support 10,000 jobs. And we need to start at the beginning of the supply chain. And our APPG for Nature looked at local authority capacity for implementing those important components of the Environment Bill. And of course, what we heard was that councils simply lack the ecological expertise in-house to implement biodiversity net gain and local nature recovery strategies, which is why investing in ecological education from an early age is so vital. And the government really must realise that ambition in the bill. So second, let's let's think about carbon sequestration potential and meeting our net zero target. Our natural carbon sinks from soils, which are our largest pool of terrestrial carbon in the UK, to grassland and our peatlands, really have to be restored if we're to meet our 2050 net zero target. Our most important landscapes for nature sequester 2 gigatons of carbon. Now, that's equivalent to 4 years of the UK's annual emissions total. Grasslands and meadows, often I think they're overlooked as nature-based solutions for mitigation purposes. The sequestration potential for peatlands is very well documented, but we're seeing some of the negative effects of well-intentioned tree planting efforts over species and carbon-rich grasslands, simply because we're not attuned to their importance as a nature-based solution. And I do want to pay tribute to the Wood Trust here, who've developed some really good guidance on recognizing the biodiversity and carbon sequestration potential of grasslands in order to make sure that we plant trees elsewhere. You know, right tree, right place. We say it so often. Yet we need action from the top to match those efforts on the ground. And third, ecosystem services potential. With 2 degrees of warming above pre-industrial levels, the Environment Agency estimate that winter rainfall could increase by 6% by the 2050s and summer rainfall by 15%. Now that would lead to more extreme river flows and sea level rise. London alone is expected to rise by 23 centimetres by the 2050s under that scenario. So even in my constituency, I have over 800 properties with an annual risk of flooding of at least 1%. That's northwest London. And in the most low-lying areas of the country, such as Norfolk, that figure is at a staggering 10,000 plus properties. And it's for this reason that we've got to get serious about conserving and grasslands for their potential to reduce the likelihood and impact of flooding. There are many examples of the economic benefits too. RSPB's Merrymead Nature Reserve saves £300,000 a year in flood prevention costs, protects 348 properties that were at risk of flooding. So floodplain meadows offer some of the most biologically abundant habitats in the country. Burnet floodplain meadow with up to 43 species per square metre, one of the richest natural grassland habitats in the UK. Such meadows provide a wealth of agricultural benefits, including nutrition for cattle and sheep, pollination, pest control, and obviously the alleviation of flood risk through storing floodwater that I've talked about. So we've seen some positive steps from government this year in beginning to recognise those benefits. The Environment Bill, which returns to the Commons immediately after the conference recess, mandates a 10% measurable increase in biodiversity for new developments, as well as establishing local nature recovery strategies to map out important habitats and what ecosystem services such habitats might provide. And I welcome George Eustace's announcement in May this year that the Environment Bill will now have a 2030 state of nature target. But it is government's inconsistency on natural capital which I believe really is continuing to hamper progress. Just weeks before COP26, the latest Greenpeace Unearthed investigation, released just yesterday, reports that more than 100 fires on carbon-rich peatlands have taken place in the north of England. Now, that's happening in the name of sport, or they call it sport, to maintain the conditions for grouse shooting. It's also happening because the government's legislation only protects 8% of our peatland. Natural England have warned that protecting and restoring our peatlands in particular is essential if we're to meet our net zero target by 2050. And that was corroborated by the Committee on Climate Change. So look, there's so much to talk about here. You're going to have a fabulous conference. I really hope that everybody not only gets a lot out of it, but actually enjoys it, because these are some of the really important things in our lives and for our future. Thanks very much.
That's fantastic, Barry. Thank you very much. Are you available to take a couple of questions before you leave, or do you need to rush off straight away?
I'm rushing, but if there are some quick questions, let me try and see what I can do. Yes, of course.
Okay, if anybody wants to raise their virtual hand, very quickly, I've got one. Do you think we would benefit from a floodplain strategy that links up Natural England and the flood and Environment Agency?
That sounds less like a question than a pretty damn obvious statement. Yes. Of course. Look, so often the problem is that, and this is, what I've been hearing from the chief executives on the select committee this afternoon. So often the problem is that different parts of the jigsaw are operating to different targets and different specifications, and it isn't a joined up holistic strategy. So absolutely, we need that cross departmental, cross NGO, cross arm's length public body working along with all the private sector to make sure that we know exactly what we're trying to do, how we're going to do it, and who has responsibility for what, and who then enforces it.
Great, thank you. Babette, can you see if anyone else has got their hand up and we can take one more?
No, I can't see any hands up at the moment.
Oh, agree with it. That's brilliant. Thank you very much. And I think we'll be meeting again in the lead up to Christmas, hopefully, at one of the APPTs.
Great. Thanks so much, Emma. All the best to everyone.
Bye-bye. Okay, so that was interesting. Let's move on. We've got 2 polls to ask you now. I said you'd be asked to do something. So, Babette, could you launch the first poll, please?
Yeah, so they are launched. So hopefully the audience will see them in the center of the screen, and they can use it, click on it, or otherwise, if they open the chat box, also appear in the chat box.
That seems fairly conclusive.
Actually, Emma, the polls won't appear on the recording, I think, so you might have to read the questions out.
Oh, okay. The poll we've got in front of us is: do you think the current policy framework to promote sustainable land uses on flood works? And we will feed back the results from the polls afterwards as well as part of the conference post information. We need some elevator music, don't we?
Yep.
Okay. Thank you very much for those, everybody. So now we can move on to our third keynote speaker, who is unable to join us today, but he sent us a video recording and apologises that he can't be here. It's Tony Juniper, who is a campaigner, writer, sustainability advisor, and a well-known British environmentalist. For more than 35 years, he has worked for change toward a more sustainable society at local, national and international levels, and he is now the chair of Natural England, where he has worked since 2019.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. My name is Tony Juniper. I am the chairman of Natural England, and it's my absolute pleasure to be with you this afternoon to share a few thoughts about some of the work that we're doing. And that pleasure is not least because of the experience I had during the summer, spending some time in the field with the Floodplain Meadows Partnership, hearing about some of the work that you're doing and hearing about your ambition for the future. When it comes to ambition for the future, one of the very exciting things that I think is going on at the moment in relation to environmental questions is the extent to which we're talking less and less about conservation and more about nature recovery. This is a very exciting shift in the narrative and marking a phase from the period when we've focused on the protection and hanging on to the last remnants of rare habitats and populations of rare and declining species, and now getting much more actively into the space of recovery and restoration.
I bet the sound is gone for me.
And plants that should be
Has it for others as well?
characteristic of certain parts of the world and indeed the country, but which have either disappeared completely or which are now very rare. That's a very important part of nature recovery. So also is the protection and the recovery of beauty, the way in which the natural environment inspires us through the way in which it touches us at a spiritual level, is something that we really mustn't underestimate or overlook. And so that beauty dimension evidently has to be part of what we're thinking about when we look to the nature recovery agenda. And at the same time as we're thinking about biological diversity and the beauty of places, another set of functions, of course, lies around this idea of ecosystem services and the practical values that society and the economy derive from healthy, natural functioning systems. And then on top of the beauty, the practical values and the biodiversity is that cultural and historic dimension of our environment. Again, something which ideally we can blend into this wider picture for nature recovery. When it comes to floodplain meadows, I'm sure nobody in this discussion today would be unaware of the fact that all four of those values for nature recovery are strongly reflected in floodplain meadows. The diversity of plants and insects, like I saw on the meadows by the River Thames near Ensham with you in the summer, really is outstanding and is the reason why many floodplain meadows, of course, are designated as sites of special scientific interest for that biodiversity, that outstanding assemblage of characteristic plants and animals that we find in those places. And then at the same time, as I stood there looking along the course of the River Thames, you realise just how iconic and characteristic a landscape this is. It's a very beautiful dimension to the way in which the place looks, and again has enormous cultural significance for many people beyond the beauty and the uniqueness of those animals and plants that you find in those places. And then at the same time as we see these natural environment functions, we see the practical functions right there at the same time. Floodplains, there is, I've always thought, a clue in the name. And as we suffer more extreme weather events, then investing in the protection and recovery of these kinds of assets that can help to ameliorate downstream impacts on communities caused by too much water in one place at one time, then evidently that's a good reason why we might want to be looking at the recovery of these places, and not only for the storage of water, but also the purity of the water, taking nutrients, for example, from the water body and holding that in the ground via plant growth, which can then be removed in the future to be able to take that away in the form of hay, which can then be fed to livestock, creating yet another ecosystem service. And then on top of these water purity, livestock feed and flood risk reduction values is, of course, the capture of carbon in those soils that lie beneath those grasslands. So these are the kinds of practical functions that are layered on top of how these places look and that vibrant biodiversity that's there. And on top of that, of course, is this great time depth. Some of these places have a very long history, some of which is documented with some of these places appearing in the Doomsday Book and being in this kind of management, not for reasons of but for reasons of economy for many centuries, thereby giving us some sense of cultural history in these landscapes. So for all these reasons, it's very, very important that we not only protect what's left, but try and restore as much as we can of what might be put back. And of course, we have lost an awful lot of these ecosystems over the centuries. And today, they are really not in what we would regard as a favourable conservation status. 2,500 hectares, more or less, left. At Natural England, we think we need to have something like 70,000 hectares more in order to achieve that goal of favourable conservation status. That's about protecting what we have, but also about recreating a lot more healthy habitat of the kind that we know we could have if only we can rise to that ambition, coordinate, build partnerships and deploy the tools that we have in a joined up way to be able to turn this corner of decline into one of recovery. Now, fortunately, we do have a lot of very good new policy tools coming through. The Environment Bill that's presently going through Parliament will deliver what we expect at Natural England to be the very powerful new spatial planning tool of local nature recovery strategies, setting out at county level exactly what will be the ambition for people to be working together to restore the natural environment, and floodplain meadows, of course, will be one priority habitat that we would like to see reflected in those spatial planning exercises, and I'm sure many other people will too. Once we've got a sense of what good looks like in terms of where nature recovery could occur, and then we can begin to see the landscape from that point of view, not only in terms of infrastructure and housing, but also in terms of where nature recovery ideally would occur, we can begin to put in place the resources and the tools to achieve that. One big tool in the kit is going to be the new environmental land management policy coming through now, being designed still, but giving some sense of shape for the future in terms of how we might be able to harness the sustainable farming incentive, local nature recovery and landscape recovery schemes to be able to go down this road of nature recovery, including in relation to these very important and very depleted ecosystems. And then on top of these kinds of policy tools will be the partnerships that we can build with the private sector, water companies, for example, and the work they need to be doing into the future to be improving water quality, and how we might be able to blend in some level of investment into ecosystem services to meet those wider goals of companies and indeed the country. So floodplain meadows, like the rest of the natural environment, hopefully is poised for now a period of exciting targeted recovery in line with targets being set in this country and hopefully also globally under the Convention of Biological Diversity, at the same time building resilience to climate change and making some contribution towards climate change mitigation. And of course, these journeys that we're on, they're long journeys, but they all start with questions getting put onto the agenda. And one question that now is being put onto the agenda as a result of the work that you and others are doing is the need to restore the health of floodplain meadows. That is a very, very important first step. And once we've understood the priority at hand, we can start to then harness the tools and the partnerships to be able to make progress into the future. At Natural England, we're very much looking forward to working with all of you, going towards this period of recovery for these ecosystems, and I'm hoping during the years ahead we will begin to see some real progress. So thank you very much for listening. Thank you for having me at your conference, and thank you for all the work that you're doing.
And thank you, Tony, in your absence back. That's great. Obviously, we can't ask Tony any questions or Barry anymore, but if people do have questions which are targeted at either of those two, then do put them in the chat and we'll try and feed them back. I can't promise we'll get responses, but you never know. I think before we move on to the next session, could we perhaps see if anyone has any questions for Trini before she has to leave? And at the same time, we're going to ask you a third poll question. So if you've got a question for Trini, could you put your hand up and Babette will unmute you and answer the poll at the same time. 70,000 hectares of floodplain in the UK should be targeted for the restoration of species-rich meadow to help deliver a range of ecosystem services, including nutrient stripping, carbon storage, biodiversity and flood storage. Do you agree or disagree? And if you disagree, please tell us why in the chat box. And we asked this because we ran this poll at another session and it was about 50-50, the split on this question, and we never knew why people had agreed or disagreed. So it'd be really good to know your thoughts. Someone has their hand up, but I can't see who it is.
No, I think that I've put a hand down again.
Anne Skinner had her hand up earlier. So perhaps we could unmute Anne and see if she still wants to ask a question.
Okay, Anne, you can unmute yourself if you want to ask a question.
No, I didn't want to ask a question, but it would be great to know what people thought of the 70,000 hectare target that we're suggesting.
Kath Mowat has said, is 70,000 hectares enough?
Okay, has anybody else got a question for Trini?
In which case, I think we'll thank Trini very much. And I'm sorry for bumping you to the first speaker, but your information is very useful. And I hope that we can look at what's happening in European floodplain policy and see how we can possibly apply some of that stuff to ourselves. Okay, I think we're going to move on then in that case, and we're already slightly behind time. So our next session, actually, you can sit back and relax and enjoy. And I can too, which would be nice. We are running we're going to play a series of virtual site visits. This summer, in anticipation of an online conference, we thought we would try and bring the field online. We approached some of the landowners we were planning to meet and asked them if they minded being interviewed. We also invited our ambassadors to submit similar videos from their own sites. So this series of 5 short films is the result of us doing this. Please forgive us as we were learning as we went along to use the equipment and remember to ask the right questions. And I think we might continue to do this to build up a series of short video case studies to put on the website and in social media. So please do let us know if this is a useful resource in the chat. Not all of the people we interviewed are here this evening. So maybe if you've got questions, you could put them in the chat and we can try and answer them as we go along. So thank you very much, and I'll hand you over to Babette to run the videos.
And I did it on certain areas of the meadows, not on my sort of very best hay bit. And then the hay was brought over and chopped and spread all on the same day, because that's how you get the maximum benefit from the seed, apparently. And so that was done, but I haven't seen a great diversity arriving straight away, but maybe one has to wait a few years. And then it flooded quite soon afterwards, and I was wondering whether actually a lot of it was washed away. But we did see the sort of, you could see the hay there. And now I'm planning to certainly make hay on one of the fields every year, which will be stored in the barn. We don't necessarily want to make hay on all the fields because of barn space, and we need it for livestock as well. And so we also do quite a lot of silage making for the livestock. And also we need to we do a lot of herbal lays, which are good for silage. And then we need to be able to graze the meadows reasonably early in the year, otherwise we run out of meadow space. The calendar date of haymaking will vary because it will depend on the season, whether and the rain and all that sort of stuff. But I think it's an art that's rather been lost. So I'm a fairly new farmer, and I do have a lot of sympathy with farmers who are pushed to really maximise production, which often means that there isn't much ability to leave space for nature. I think most farmers want to have nature on their farm, and they love it if orchids appear or birds are nesting and that sort of thing. But that's why the stewardship, I do think that this countryside stewardship funding is so important for small, less intensive farmers, so that they can actually make a living from their land. For me as a farmer, to really be able to maximise the biodiversity and, say, revert to the old ways of doing things, I would need help. It might be some financial help to sort of make up for lost production, and perhaps capital schemes as well for putting up infrastructure like barns to make the hay.
We started to go organic, 2016 anyway, just as a natural process of the way we were farming, because we're the Pasture Fed Livestock Association. We're driven absolutely by trying to make it biodiverse. I mean, that's our reason for being here to some extent, is building soil health, which will in turn create biodiversity. So yeah, that's all we're about really, as regenerative farmers. That's what we do. We want to make the whole of floodplain more species rich, because when we arrived it was probably 3 or 4 grass types and that was about it. And since we've stopped applying anything to it, we're already seeing more diverse species coming into the mix. But it'd be nice to try and revert it back to what it might have been at one other point in time. And up to date, we haven't done enough to do that. So that's what we want to do with it, really, yeah. I think it works perfectly with our farming model. I mean, we're low input anyway, so our only real cost is the haymaking cost, actually, is making forage for the winter. So if we could do that and help bring back those meadows to what they might have been, then it works perfectly within our system, and we'd then graze it afterwards. It floods sort of November onwards anyway, so we could never get on it. It works perfectly for us, actually. We don't have any of our own equipment because we don't have enough to make it worthwhile. So I use a contractor, and we book him in, and he comes in and does it when he thinks the time is ready. Restoration of the meadows in an agri-environment scheme makes far more sense than us just to try and launch to do it ourselves. I mean, we don't have to do a lot more, but there are fields that are far more inaccessible for big contractors, which means for us to do it ourselves, it's a much more manual enterprise, and that's much more expensive. And until we get better forage off those fields, it's not really economical to do it right now. In 3 or 4 years' time, it probably would be. But right now, it's probably not. We've got far easier alternative fields to cut. An agri-environment scheme really would help us allow us to take hay off those fields, where otherwise we couldn't make a financial argument stack up really without some sort of payment, I don't think, because we have far cheaper alternative fields to cut, is the reality of it. So, given how much we've lost in terms of certainly meadow and all the rest of it, the only way we're going to get it back is more income, more money. There's no other way. We can do tiny pockets, but it has to happen at landscape level, and that needs money.
Today I'm here visiting Swampy Meadow in northeast Staffordshire. I'm here to meet Graham Prince, the farmer. I'm going to have a look at his meadow and see what he's been up to.
I decided to restore this meadow because it's on the side of the River Dove in the Dove Valley, and it's a very good area for butterflies, and I wanted to try and encourage them more to breed here really, and the same with the birds. It's a very good area for birds and animals. It's just a case of trying to enhance what was here and give them more chance to survive really.
Swampy Meadow gets its name because it's adjacent to this fantastic fen meadow that's dominated by meadowsweet, but it has other species such as wood clubrush here. We're next to the River Dove, so you get these kind of wetter habitats that then transition into the drier hay meadow.
I started to restore this meadow by introducing some seeds really to begin with, but mainly by haymaking it, so managing it in a way that was spreading the existing wildflower seeds that were here already. And I'm also hoping to introduce green hay in the future to introduce more variety of wildflowers here.
The meadow was restored in 2018 with a small amount of hay rattle, and now what's happened 3 years on since introducing that hay rattle is it started to spread quite nicely in the field, and we're getting some additional species spreading across the field.
More monitoring would be useful really of the water table, both of the winter where it's been sort of virtually flooded, and in the summer when it turns into a hay meadow, so a different variety of plants can thrive in both situations really. And that's where the dip wells come in really. We can monitor the information we've got from the dip wells to understand how the field is changing from year to year. thing I like most about this meadow is the fact that there's flowers right from the spring through the summer to the autumn. There's the lady smock for the orange-tipped butterflies in the spring, a lot of it, and then you've got your rattle and your knapweed, meadow sweet that comes through, and it makes very nice quality hay. The biggest challenge about this project is this particular field is a very small part of a bigger project that we've got down here. We've got 40 odd acres down here we're trying to restore into wetland habitat, as well as wildflower meadows. Now we're trying to create scrapes for waders, and the planning permission and all the research that's had to be done, the monitoring and the funding that we needed has been quite immense. Having an agri-environmental scheme has helped a lot. I'm a member of a White Peak Farmers Facilitation Group, and I've been struggling to get into a higher tier for several years, not been able to do it until I joined the group, and we've been able to join the scheme now, the higher tier. Key message to the government would be to make it easier for people to rewild an area without having to go through planning permissions and red tapes. It's a nightmare really, and the expense of applying for planning permission and all the hoops you have to jump through. I'd say get all your research done and your funding in place, because without it it's just too much of a job really, too big. You need to know what you're doing before you start and what you can do before you start. Get all your research in place. Don't give up, keep going and get advice, because without it you don't know what you're going to come up against.
Decided to restore this meadow because it's close proximity to North Meadow. It's actually adjacent to it, and it had the potential to be restored to MG4 grassland, which is what North Meadow is as well. We went about this by initially taking soil samples and looking at the hydrology, the pH, and then whether the seed was available. Then we looked at the land which had been sprayed for many years by the tenant farmer and was basically a monoculture. So went about cutting it short and then glyphosating the whole area and then harrowing. It was not too difficult, just deciding on doing that and getting the right funding was the key to the go-ahead, and obviously getting the landowners' permission to do that. The biggest challenge was actually getting the seed, preparing it and getting the correct method and spread onto this area. So one of the main indicator species of MG4 grassland, and particularly good to have in the restoration site, is these Anglosorbia here, Vishnalis. Looking quite good, not much of it, but it is expanding. What I enjoy most about it now is the profusion of the similar species that are doing really well to North Meadow. And also that it has got a reasonably well-established relation of snake's head fritillary, Fritillaria miniagris. If you look here, this is the seed pod, the developing seed pod of Fritillaria miniagris. These were hand-harvested in April from North Meadow with several volunteers. Then I cleaned it and stored it in a cool temperature with plenty of air circulating around it. After we had sown the main seed in here, I hand sowed by sectioning it off into areas and weighing out the grams of fertility seed and hand sowed this. So it's a real success. This year there were about 200 fertility flowers that we could see, and the first flower came up 5 years after sowing. So absolutely fantastic to see more and more spreading out from that one first initial seed. It's a success story. It's been 10 years since the initial surveys. The second year after the seed wasn't brilliant, and then the year we put some more seed on here, and from then it has been a real success. The message I'd give to other people is do your research really well, get all the ground study details in place, do your pH studies, and don't expect this to be an overnight success. We really need to look at these areas. There's just not very many of them anymore, and they are absolutely vital, not only for the wildlife that they bring the interest to people, but the carbon storage that they provide.
We might have come to a grinding halt.
Also,
there is one more, but I'm not sure it's loading. So I think what we'll do is maybe try and play it a little bit later on, if that's okay. Babette, have you been kicked out because of it, or are you there?
No, I am here, but on one laptop, the video has actually played to its end, but on the other one, it's still a bit to go. So we can stop this video now and we'll try again later.
Yeah, let's do that. I hope enough of you were able to see those videos to make it worthwhile playing. They're a lovely set of films, and there is another equally lovely from Longmead that we will also try and play a little bit later on. So I do apologise about that. That's your inexperience of not having run an online conference before. A lesson learned for me. Okay, so in that case, we've got a little chance for some questions. Should we try and do that instead? If you have a question about any of the site visits, I can't guarantee that the farmers or the people in the videos will be able to answer them, but I might be able to help, and we can feedback questions or any comments. Is that useful for those people that could see them? Those kind of things. And if not, then I suggest we take a 5-minute break and reconvene at quarter two for our Floodplain Meadows question time. Can anyone see any hands up in the chat? Oh, Rosedale, who is one of the speakers, the first video, has said she's since got funding for wetland restoration, so that's exciting. And we'll definitely keep an eye on that with Rose and support her where we can. I have another question. Is it Katrina and Kevan? Can you unmute them, Babette?
Yeah, Katrina, you can now turn your mic on.
It's Katrina who would be the final video, who we haven't been able to play yet. But we can't hear you, Katrina. Sorry. Can you type your question in the chat, maybe? Yeah, okay. Sorry, Katrina. We haven't played your video and we can't answer your question either. Is there anyone else who's got their hand up that might be able to ask a question? Again, I can't see. No. Okay.
No, we have no hands up.
No. Okay. In which case, why don't we give ourselves a 5-minute break and reconvene at 5:45 when we will we'll see if we can get the video running again, and then we'll do our Farmers Floodplain Meadows question time session. Thank you all for your forbearance, and I apologise for the technical glitches. Let's hope it gets better. Thank you. Hi everybody. Hope you've all come back again. My daughter just came in and asked me for her Cubs jumper. I'm running a conference. Anyway, she's gone now, thankfully. So, okay, we're going to try and run the final video one more time. And I've also made Katrina a presenter, so I'm hoping that she can now ask her question. Should we try that again? Katrina, do you want to try that again?
Oh, yes. Does it work now?
Yes, I can hear you. Thank you.
So my question was, are all the meadows in the videos that we saw, are they all grazed afterwards and with cattle or with sheep? I had two questions. And the other was just, I lost the sound with the North Meadow. Was that hand gathered seed from North Meadow that was resown? I just missed that bit on the North Meadow.
The North Meadow question I can answer. The seed that was sown originally was green hay and commercial seed. They had a couple of goes at it, so it ended up being a mix. But the fritillary seed was hand collected and then hand sown. So they did throw quite a few different methods at that site, and it had a very shaky start. It got massively flooded in the first year. And then they had another go putting some more seed on that was brush harvested that time. There's a case study about it on our website, actually, which gives you a little bit more information. And it's, as Anita said, it's taken 10 years and now it's looking really good, but it has taken that long to look that good. So, you have to be patient. The other question about cutting and grazing, a couple of the sites are still in the kind of the development phase of working out how they're going to manage them. The other sites, the other two, so I don't know White Peak. Anne Cantrell is here. She might be able to answer that. And Prior's Ham, the site next to North Meadow, is cut and grazed. Does that answer your questions?
Yeah, great. Sorry, I'm still on.
Okay. So should we have here you go. Rose has answered in the chat. She is on the line. Thank you, Rose. She says hers is cut and grazed after. So, but she's very early stages. Tim Thompson from Hampton Gay. He's just starting to experiment with cutting in one of his fields, and one of his pasture is grazed only. So they're all different. So shall we have a go at running that video now? And if it doesn't work, we'll just move on to question time. Thank you. I'm here today to look at some restoration that's been done adjacent to Longmead, which is an ancient meadow in Oxfordshire. We're going to meet Katrina Bass, who is co-owner of Longmead, who's going to tell us a bit more about what she's done.
So we inherited this amazing 1,000-year-old ancient floodplain hay meadow. Our predecessors had a dispute with the neighbour because one winter the cowmen were driving across the meadow and destroyed this area, a strip round the track. So they were required to reseed it, and they reseeded it with ryegrass. We bought this 20 years ago, and for the last 20 years we've had this strip of ryegrass that's grown tall and has no diversity at all. So last year, 2020, we decided to use some green hay from the meadow to try and restore its diversity. In order to kind of restore it, we cut the hay very short as we could, shorter than we would normally do a hay cut, just to make sure that it was easier to rough it up, basically. And we roughed it up by harrowing it we harrowed it 100%. Normally you need to do about up to 50%, but because there was nothing interesting here at all, we thought we would go the whole hog. So we harrowed it. Then we took green hay from the meadow behind me, which is very, very species rich. We've got over 150 different species in our meadow. We cut it with a forage harvester, which chops up the grass very, very small and importantly captures the seed. So the normal haymaking process, you cut it and then you let the hay lie on the meadow and the seed drops out. This keeps the seed in, puts it into a forage harvester, and then we take it from the forage harvester and put it in a muck spreader. So what you usually use for spreading manure on fields, and blow out the chopped up hay with the seed in onto this strip here, and then we roll it to make sure the seed makes a good contact with the soil. And then, so that was last August. Then the cattle came on and grazed it, and their hooves help also to tread in the seed. And then this March we topped it just to make sure. So the really critical element is the yellow rattle, which you can see here behind me. It's grown fantastically well, and in the first year that's really what we want to see. We're not expecting a great diversity of other flowers, but the yellow rattle is critical, and so we just topped the grass to give the yellow rattle a head start before it starts growing. Obviously you don't want to cut its heads off because it's the only annual in the meadow. This is the yellow rattle. This is the absolute key ingredient in making meadows. It's the only annual in the meadow, and it's semi-parasitic on the grasses, so it will reduce the vigour of the grasses. I mean, if you look here, the grass still is very high. Once this really gets in there, it will bring down the height of the grasses so that the perennial flowers can grow and flourish. So we're very excited that we've got so much rattle in our first year. Sometimes it doesn't take at all, so all of this business is a bit of a gamble, but hopefully in this one we're on the right side of it. My key piece of advice is, if one plants a tree, for example, if you're planting a pear tree, you think the saying is plant a pear for your heirs. And I think one has to think of the same thing about a meadow. In fact, I think of it, if you think of it like a child that's sort of snotty and horrible for a very long time and then grows into something beautiful. So you've just got to be, this is not very beautiful, what we've got at the moment. So this is my snotty child, and I'm hoping that, in 10 years it'll be a bit more interesting. In 20 years it will flower into this amazing adult meadow, but actually the science says that it's 150 years, so it really is for your heirs, and that's what you need to be focusing on. So my key message to government is, if we're serious about creating nature recovery networks of meadows or other kinds of plants, the landowners and the farmers need to be at the table from the start in a level playing field as part of the network. Otherwise, we might as well all go home.
Well, that was lovely, and I'm so glad we got to, hopefully some of you got to see the final video. What I'll do is I'll put them up on our YouTube channel tonight or tomorrow morning, and they'll be available for you to watch from about lunchtime tomorrow. So hopefully you'll be able to catch up with them. Thank you very much for your forbearance with the technology. So I'm going to move us straight on in that case to our Floodplain Meadows question time. Think gardener's question time, but perhaps being broadcast on Radio 4, and that's what we're going to try and aim for. At your registration, we invited people to submit questions in advance, and we have some questions in advance for this session, and we'll start with those. But if you have a question you'd like to ask as well, we'll try and fit others in, and please put them in the chat as we go along, or at the end, if we invite more questions, put your hands up and hopefully we can unmute you. Once we get started, I will invite those who submitted a question to put their virtual hands up. So Babette and unmute you to ask your questions, then we'll move on to the next one. I hope that's clear. But first, before we begin, let's meet the panel. Panel, can I please ask you to introduce yourselves to the conference? Starting with, well, I can only see Andy at the moment, so can I have the other panel members up on screen as well? Just waiting for David. Shall we start with Andy? Oh, sorry, David.
Hi, Emma, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
For some reason, my camera's not cooperating, so it may have to be audio only.
Okay, that's fine. We'll carry on. We'll start off with Andy because he's to the left of my screen. Andy, could you say a bit about who you are, please?
Hiya, my name's Andy Rumming. I farm with my family near Cricklade. And yeah, so we've got about 300 cattle, 90 suckler cows, and basically we feed a lot of them on floodplain meadow, species-rich hay all winter. And then we retail meat, and now we retail leather, and we use the whole kind of floodplain meadow as a kind of a driver for those sales. So yeah, we make lots of hay, and yeah, we also make a lot of hay on North Meadow, which I think you've seen quite a lot about already.
Thank you, Andy. That's lovely. Can I ask Matt? Go next.
Yeah, Matt Johnson from the Wildlife Trust, working in Northamptonshire, where we've got a number of floodplain meadow nature reserves, and also worked with various landowners doing restoration projects of various size, shape and success, and also sit on the Floodplain Meadows Partnership Steering Group for the Wildlife Trusts.
Great, thanks, Matt. Claire, you're next in line.
Hi everyone, Claire Hill from FAI Farms. We are slightly behind Andy in the fact that we do a similar thing, grazing cattle and sheep on floodplains as aftermath grazing, but also using the hay for two purposes. One is to feed outwintering the cattle, so to provide feed, but also with the purpose of helping to spread that seed and kind of reseed some other areas of the farm, which so far seems to be working quite well, although anecdotal only really at the moment. We're 1,200 acres, of which about 50% of the farm goes underwater for a large majority of the winter these days. And we have an interesting bit in that we manage two sides of the river, one which is managed as a triple SI, and one that was arable up until about 18 years ago when we put it back into grazing, but haven't given it such the amount of care maybe over the years, but we're starting to do more. We've done some restoration and various other things.
That's great, thanks very much, Claire. And finally, David.
Hi there, I'm David Going, an academic at the Open University and currently director of the Floodplain Meadows Partnership. So I'm a botanist by training and have been undertaking research on floodplain meadows for the past 30 years.
Thank you. So I'm going to invite our first question to be asked, and that comes from Tracy Doherty. Tracy, could you raise your virtual hand, please? And Babette will unmute you, and then you can ask your question. Is it going to work? Is she there?
Yeah,
yes,
she's here. Okay, Tracy, you will now be able to unmute yourself.
Everyone, sorry, I'm struggling with the Maine Coon who's decided they want to lie on my headphones. Sorry. I'm trying to remember what my question was actually. I think it was, is there going to be a code like for woodlands and for peatlands for conservation of floodplain meadows going forward for carbon? And I think that was it. Emma, is that right?
That is well done. Good memory. Thank you very much, Tracy. Yes, will there be a carbon code created for floodplain meadows as per peat and trees? Who wants to have a go answering this first? I'm going to look at Matt because you're the bottom left-hand corner of my screen.
Thank you very much. I don't know if there will be one. I think sort of the various partners from the steering group are very keen that there is one, and Floodplain Meadows Partnership is as well. And it's something probably be pushing for slightly longer term, with sort of elms and cop being the main priorities at the moment. And I imagine David has probably got a lot of insight into what data has been collected so far that could be inputted into that and what still needs collected.
The reason why I'm quite interested in this is that we've, as Emma will may mention or refer to later, maybe in the conference, I nearly lost 2.8 of relic floodplain meadow to tree planting, and obviously this is my fear that we're, while everybody's got these codes just for woodland and peatland, we're actually going to lose some critical habitat, for floodplain meadows. So I think it's really important that we put grassland code. I really do.
Andy, would you like to add anything?
I was just going to say, so yes, we've just had some work by Rothamsted looking at various fields, and our floodplain meadow came out at 17% organic matter or soil carbon, which stuck out like a sore thumb with the rest of their data they had. So it's really important, but we still get some agreement on how you take those measurements. So what depth you're taking them to, what system you're using, and we've got to get more farmers to do things like the carbon cutting toolkit, and then you can get lots of data.
Okay, thank you.
And Claire, do you want to say anything, Claire?
Yeah, sorry. Oh, I don't know if I've got anything to add. Nothing to add other than what the other speakers have said on that one.
Okay, David.
Well, just to say that it's a good point, and we are lobbying for a code for grasslands, and the Plant Life charity are also anxious that grasslands shouldn't be omitted. And as Andy says, we know floodplain meadows are very rich in carbon. They can have very high percentage in their topsoil, but even more critical is that they have carbon at depth. So there have been some studies in the States showing them to be quite rich in carbon to 2 or 3 meters below the surface, because the alluvial soils are fairly unique the way they've built up over time. So yeah, I sympathise with your concern, Tracy, that we probably shouldn't be planting trees on that sort of soil, and so we need some official way of recognising it. I don't think there is one at the moment, but we're hopeful that it will come.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Kind of what I expected. I really do support you going that route. I really do think we need it, certainly to help us kind of conserve in our roles. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Tracy. And I'll just add to that. There's a whole morning session tomorrow on soil and carbon. And we're going to be presenting some of our early findings from our year 1 of the Ecover project, which is very exciting, where we've been recording soil carbon in meadows. And Jenny Phelps is talking on a Thursday evening, I think, can't quite remember, about a farm and soil carbon code that is being developed by a wide range of partners. So there are people throughout the conference who will be looking at this, but as yet there is no answer to your question, I don't think. But I think a lot of people want the answer. Okay, so let's move on to the next question then. I'm going to invite Debbie Wilkins, if she can remember her question, to ask it. Can you put your hand up, Debbie, if you're in the audience? Have you found her, Babette? I can see a hand.
Yep, she can now unmute herself, Debbie.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, hello, Debbie. Hi.
Hi, I'm trying to remember my question. What I was asking, I think, about is about the best way of grazing meadows to keep the species or to enhance them, whether we should be haymaking and aftermath grazing or mob grazing or set stocking. I have some species-rich meadows. 2018, when we had the drought, I did a bit of mob grazing because we were short of grazing, and I could definitely see a difference the next year where I'd mob graze versus hay cut, and I didn't know whether that was good or bad. So over to you.
That's a great question, Debbie, and it's really pertinent. It's a question there's a lot of discussion about at the moment. I'm going to invite David to speak first on this one.
Okay. Yes, there's a lot in that question. certainly aftermath grazing is beneficial, and the important thing is to get the grass grazed quite low by the end of autumn when the stock are removed, to avoid dead plant material, thatch building up on the surface and inhibiting the smaller herbs. So having a thorough grazing, I don't think it matters dreadfully which type of grazing animal you use. Alison MacDonald, who was with us earlier, has done some detailed research on this and suggested that cattle perhaps gave the highest plant diversity, but sheep were also very effective and gave a higher diversity than not grazing. Your question was also encompassing whether grazing in place of the hay cut might work. For the floodplain meadow community, it's not tolerant of spring grazing, so many of the species would disappear if there's regular spring grazing. So holding off until after the 1st of July with the grazing is beneficial, and probably having a mixture of cut in some years and graze in others is fine. It depends on the local circumstances, that if your meadow is perhaps over fertile and you're trying to bring down the nutrient availability, perhaps it's receiving a lot from sediment, then cutting does have an advantage over grazing. But if that's not the issue and the nutrient availability is fine, that the herb grass mix is where you want it, then whether you cut or whether you graze probably isn't as important.
Yeah.
Thank you, David. Claire, do you want to add, or Andy, you were going to add something to that then? Do you want to go first? No, you go, Andy.
I was just going to say, some of it's about practicalities. So, yeah, what tools do you have in your toolbox? If you have someone with the stock or your own stock and they're available to move to where you want to, great. If you've got your own haymaking equipment, great. But yeah, it's working out what tools you've practically got and that you can get in place at the right time. But yeah, with us, we are haymaking and aftermath grazing, and that is great. And we also try and do the haymaking as early as people will allow us, because that generally gets us a better weather window and it gets us a better hay product that is more valuable. Trying to get animals to graze stuff that hasn't been cut in August, you normally see a animal performance drop off, so they're not going to gain much weight, and so therefore it's much better to cut it early as hay and then aftermath graze something that's quite green in sort of September. But some of it comes down to practicalities and trying to have a plan and having a plan B as well.
Thank you, Andy. Claire, do you want to add to that? You're having this debate yourselves, aren't you?
Definitely. And so we do a mixture of both. But we're partly the practicality thing really comes into it. But for us, it's a lot of area of hay meadow, and we end up with just too much hay that we can manage and not enough grazing. So we do end up grazing some of it. I would say after the later for allowing the plants that I've got in a real, I've got myself really strung out about the hay cutting dates and thinking it's too late, you know, it really impacts on the quality of our hay. And it does with my kind of old paradigm of thinking about quality. But now when I was just focused on ME and the kind of traditional conventional measures of hay quality, but now I think about nutrient density and species diversity, and I see the positive impact that the hay is having when we use it to feed our outwintered animals, and that we don't have proof of this, but anecdotally they eat less. So it's almost like, because it's more nutritious, as in it's serving their mineral and all those other kind of micronutrient dietary requirements, it's almost like they don't need to eat as much, so we use less of it, which is interesting, and the animals still gain and maintain condition just like we need them to. We're talking about sucklers, though, just to be clear on that, because I think Debbie might be in the dairy game, so just to be clear that's what we're talking about, is suckler cows. But we can't make hay out of all of it, so we do graze some, but we do try and graze it as late as possible, because where we do graze it earlier, then it does impact on some of the species, but equally we can't graze all of it late, because otherwise we've got no spring grass. So what we try and do is just rotate it round, so we don't graze the same fields in the spring all the time, and we try and graze as late as possible. And the reason for hay cutting versus grazing in the main would be, to Andy's point about the fact that you just have too much material of not so great quality. Although in the kind of new world of grazing, and to respond to that question of mob grazing, set stocking, or what's the best, we traditionally would have always aftermath grazed on set stocking with sheep, just because the practicality of the location meant that sheep were the easiest thing to get around there. But we don't have sheep anymore. We've just got cattle, and so we're now grazing with cattle. And in the last few years, we have actually mob grazed it afterwards as well. I don't know yet. I don't think we've got the data yet to know whether there's been a difference. Certainly, we like doing it like that for all the reasons that we now like mob grazing. And it's sort of longer rest periods for some areas. It also means that it kind of ekes the grass out. Particularly with sheep, they're not kind of doing so much selective grazing. So I would like to think that mob grazing the aftermath will have a positive impact versus set stocking. I think that's where I feel about it. And we would like to experiment with some mob grazing instead of hay cutting, because of course the whole hay cutting process is fossil fuel using. So if we could be grazing instead of hay cutting, then that's good for all of us. But I think it would be making sure that we were good with our timing on when that would happen. So not too much long stemmy material, but late enough that we're not affecting the species. And almost each season and each year is different on deciding when to do that. And we've definitely not perfected it, but we're thinking a lot more about it now. I think the biggest change for us has been, and as a market opportunity, is the interest in the hay from the area. There's almost quite a really good demand from all sorts of people wanting to buy species-rich hay, from force feed to dairy farmers. We sell it to everyone. So as an opportunity, as a product, a hay cut is quite a good thing. And we don't store our bales anymore, so we put them straight out in the field, so we don't have a storage cost. So that's been another thing we've changed, not linked necessarily to it being hay meadow hay or to floodplain meadow hay, but just the way that we run it now. We just put the bales straight out at haymaking time. We take them straight up to the field they're going to outwinter on. So we've kind of cut a really big handling and storage cost out of our business as well. So that's been another benefit, just with this kind of reframing the way we think about it, I think, which has been an interesting angle for me.
That's very comprehensive, Claire. Thank you very much. Have you got anything to add to that, Matt?
Not a lot. It's probably just to agree that, well, for us, a lot of it is down to the practicalities, and it really comes down to, can we get hay kitting on, or do we have stock nearby, etc. And we sort of manage our meadows in a whole variety of ways. The ones where we've consistently managed to get hay cut followed by aftermath grazing are the ones that are looking the best. But equally, we've got two meadows side by side. One we hay cut and aftermath graze with sheep, and then one next to it, because of the wet flushes, we only cattle graze. And the hay cut one has much more abundance of wildflowers, whereas the grazed one has more diversity, but also rush areas of quite sort of dense rush and sedges as well. So really makes a difference. We've worked on restoration projects as well, where they've only been able to hay cut because they can't have stock on site. That has been sort of slow, but we have started to see progress in recent years. And really, just a lot of it comes down to just getting some management on site is always better than missing out on a year.
Yeah, and to excuse the pun, but it is horses for courses to a certain extent, isn't it? You do what you can I mean, the general approach that we take is a hay cut in a floodplain is important to balance those nutrients, but it does depend on your ability to do that, and the machinery that you've got and the weather in any one year. Does that help, Debbie?
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. Thank you. I've just to add that when we did the mob grazing, it was at the same time as hay cutting. So it was middle of July, and half the field was cut for hay, and then left the other half, and I mob grazed it. So because I didn't have anything to feed them, rather than bringing them hay out, they ate it rather than me making it. If you see what I mean.
Yeah.
And so, but it was really interesting that a year later I could see the dividing line, and it looked very different. And I just wondered whether, if I carried on mob grazing, whether I would change the species mix and whether that would be good or bad. But yeah, thank you. It's very interesting.
When I next come and visit your fields, we could have a look if you want.
Yes,
that would be really interesting to see. Yeah, but it's a really big topic of discussion at the moment, and we're looking into whether we can investigate it more from an evidence-based perspective, but we haven't got anywhere with that yet. Okay, I'm going to ask our next question asker, who is Damon Bridge. Damon, could you put your hand up, please? And can you remember your question?
Damon, you can unmute yourself now.
Hello there. Hi. Hey, thanks everyone. Really great to listen to this. It's kind of been slightly covered, my question, and I think there's going to be a lot of stuff about it. It's interesting to know that other people are obviously struggling with the same thing. So I work down on the Somerset levels, and we've got big areas of peat, and there's a lot of sort of drive for restoration of peat. And so my question is really based around that, and how do we best balance the need to build resilience within the floodplains that reduce our carbon emissions by restoration of peatlands, with the need to maintain and conserve the traditional farmed and late hay-cut meadows. I know, I mean, just to sort of follow up on that, we're looking at opportunities to there's tens of thousands of hectares of peat with pretty high carbon emissions here, and some of which has got some really great species-rich hay meadow on it. And it might not be entirely possible to restore blocks without losing some of that value, and whether we can move, it's all about whether we can move these habitats to towards the edges of the floodplains or on slightly higher ground, but just be interesting to hear what the panel feel about balancing those needs.
Great, thanks, Damon. Matt, would you like to go first on this one?
Yeah, it's a tricky question. I think it comes back to what's discussed earlier about sort of, well, it was right tree, right place, but sort of right habitat in the right place, and having a diversity of sort of pure peatland, grassland, meadows, etc. within a wetland is really important. So all having carbon sequestration benefits, and hopefully sort of things like nature recovery network mapping and the Environment Bill and the like will really sort of help people plan out where each habitat can go. And I think there's some talks later in the conference about looking at historical maps, and that can really give an idea of where you can restore certain habitats and where you can't, and then sort of working from that stage outwards.
Thank you. Andy, do you want to add anything there?
Right. I think it's going to get really interesting. So first of all, having a real plan of what you want to do for different objectives is really good. So one is, can you practically deliver those objectives? So again, it's about, have you got the tools in the toolbox? And I think that's going to get really interesting with the subsidy system massively changing. And we've already started now. So I think there's going to be less farmers out there who can potentially provide services to third parties to manage floodplain meadows, i.e. there's going to be a less stock around. So you've got to kind of work that in. And the carbon sequestration side, again, we've got carbon markets are really now firing up. So everybody wants to buy my carbon. And there's some really shonky schemes out there. So I think we might see people thinking that peatland restoration is the way to earn the most cash. And so I think over the next potentially 3 years, there's going to be lots of changes that might mean your best laid plans may be easier or more difficult to actually deliver.
Okay.
Yeah, okay. David, do you want to answer anything next?
Yep. Hi, Damon. Yeah, this is an important question, particularly for your Somerset levels. And we have done quite a lot of work on those systems, which are or have the potential of being managed hydrologically really quite delicately. And I think it is possible to do both things, to conserve the peat and to manage an area for species-rich hay meadow. But it does take a level of fine control that you keep the water table high through the year. And the Dutch are the real experts at that. They have systems where the water table sits just about 30 centimetres below the surface. And way back in the 90s, we did some work showing that peat loss really only occurred when the water tables dropped deeper than that. So it is possible, but it's a balancing act to keep the peat and to manage for hay. And it would be a shame to lose some of those really old meadows on the Somerset levels. But if the ability to manage the water starts to get disrupted, and where areas the water level falls further and you start to lose peat and the ground starts to sink, it then becomes very difficult to manage for meadows. And in that case, it's probably better to try and manage for a tall fen or swamp habitat instead. So I think, as Matt started off saying, it's good to have a mosaic of different things. And again, it's pragmatism of what you can do where, but trying to hold on to at least some of those old hay meadows, which in Somerset are absolutely brilliant for all sorts of services, such as nutrient removal from the floodplain and for pollinators. It's really worthwhile doing so.
Excellent, thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, David. And Claire, do you want to add anything to that?
I know nothing about peat, so I'm going to say anything.
Okay. Thank you for your honesty.
You haven't got it, I think.
Okay, in that case, we'll move on to our fourth question, which comes from Samantha Cook. Samantha, could you put your hand up and Babette will unmute you? And can you remember your question?
You can unmute now, Samantha.
Hello. I'm just wondering, what the community can do to be able to support the conservation of floodplain meadows, especially as there's a greater interest now in the community getting involved in things like litter picking and protecting the nature that's around.
That's a great question and a change of tack, in fact. So who should we invite to go first? Matt, you can go first again.
Yeah, I think there are quite different answers on this. In terms of sort of a wildlife trust point of view, managing nature reserves, then local communities are very important to what we do, and some sort of having friends of groups for particular sites is really great. They get involved in monitoring, helping us to better understand our sites. Sort of we do some botanical monitoring, but having local people with the time to do hydrological monitoring and things like that can really help. Also be the eyes and the ears, helping out with stock checks, etc. And sort of able to influence potentially surrounding landowners as well, and sort of promote the importance of what we have and promote the importance of restoring similar adjacent fields if possible is really great. I know, Sammy, we've talked a lot about Tailby Meadow, which you've mentioned in the chat, where we've kind of lost a lot of opportunities to do that restoration because planning application has been approved for the surrounding land. So we're going to end up with a meadow that's saved from planning because you can't build on it, obviously, but surrounded by houses on most of the sides, and obviously losing that chance to restore and expand it and sort of create that network as well. But this process has really inspired the local community, and that meadow has become a lot more loved and a lot more understood. in the last couple of years.
That's really interesting. Thank you, Matt. Andy, would you like to go next?
Yeah, so I think what the local community can do is actually kind of buy meadow products. And I probably would say that as I sell beef, but it's really important, because if you want them to survive, they've got to economically add up. And if you're, well, even whether you're a private landowner or an organisation, a charity, etc., if it washes its face, it's much more likely to survive and be able to do more of it. And so I think engaging with the local community around buying meat, most people are not vegetarian or vegan. And also there's a lot of people that are kind of guilty meat eaters. And so if you can show that the in my case, beef is coming from, a meadow where there's 200 plus species, that can really tip the balance. And so there's a huge amount of consumers, and if you can show that traceability, they will part with their cash for that product. But it's not just meat, it's experiences as well. And so we run paid for farm walks, we run free ones to different sort of sectors. And so again, the floodplain meadow is really useful because it's so dynamic. It's a great place for winter walks where it's in flood with birds on it. It's a great place for our fertility walks, which we now ticket because they're really popular. And then, we're looking at other products. So our leather, for example, it's stamped with a fertility logo to try and make that connection. So I would like to think that, so in the past, our floodplain meadows have been the least profitable bit of our farm. But going forwards, I think they potentially will be the most profitable bit. And I think we've got to talk about money a bit more with some of these things, because we can't rely on government funding. And I think with the particular administration at the moment, if people think they're going to run out of elms, they've got another thing coming. So we've got to look at markets that will actually do that for us, where we're in control of what we're doing with sort of plant communities like this.
Thank you, Andy. That's a really interesting and different perspective. Claire, where do you stand on community groups?
Yeah, I just I'm listening on, really jealous of the marketing angle and thinking we should be doing something more on our products. We're not enough of it, and the idea of having a fertility stamped on the leather is just amazing. So that's brilliant. I think so. For us, we're not selling directly at the moment, and so we've less of that angle. But I would totally support everything that was just said. I think that, and as a farmer, I see that as a real opportunity. So where actually ruminant livestock are part of the solution. Environment, climate change, biodiversity loss, cattle are such a key part of that, and meadows are a really nice way of being able to articulate that. But for us, if I was to say now, what could a community group come if they approached us, and what could they do to help us on our farm? It would be some monitoring, actually, of birds at the moment, but of species, and understanding about what they are and what they mean. And we've just had a flock of cattle egrets spending some weeks with us, which we're just learning about at the moment, but are quite rare. But are only living on the floodplain meadow. We've got groups of cattle all over, but they're just on the meadow, and would just be indicative of the species richness that is there in the plants, which means we've got the insects, which means we've got the birds, which is really exciting. And we want to be able to tell more of those stories. And one of our favourite things to talk about is Facebook posts, when people just put things like take pictures along the footpaths and just talk about the number of insects and things like that they're seeing. So just kind of spreading the word about pollinators, about species richness, how important all of that is for the fundamentals of our food production. Like, biodiversity isn't a nice thing to have, although it is a nice thing to have. Basically, we won't survive as a species if we don't sort it out. And floodplain meadows are incredibly species diverse, and that's really exciting. So just as an approach, as a group, come and talk to us about finding out more about what we've going on in our different fields, because some of us are monitored, some of them aren't. But equally, just spreading the word about what's happening and talking about it and taking lots of pictures and sharing them on social media would be something else that would be really nice.
Thank you, Claire. And finally, David.
Yeah, I think the other panel members have hit all the key points. The key one probably is this idea of raising awareness. That I remember leading a guided walk on North Meadow and talking to someone who'd lived in the adjacent town for 20 years, and they were telling me it's the first time they'd been on the meadow, and they thought it was wonderful, and they hadn't appreciated it was there. So I think there's a lot of work that can be done by local groups to raise awareness within their own community, because the more people who understand and appreciate what meadows are, when it comes to deciding on planning applications, if there's a lot of local knowledge and desire to keep the meadow, then that can influence what happens planning wise. And as I think Matt said, that there are practical things people can do, such as dip wells to see what's happening with the water levels, or just record floods and the duration and timings of them, or as Claire has said, to monitor birds, bumblebees, butterflies. It's all useful information that local people can get involved with. So another aspect is to look at the historical angle of the meadows, to see from old maps what their floodplains looked like in the past, and try and develop an understanding of that. And I know that's coming up later in the conference. And again, some people are engaged by counting butterflies, while others are engaged by historical aspects. So I think it's good to have a number of different strands. And then picking up on Andy's points, it's important for people to appreciate where their food comes from, and the difference between pasture-fed meat compared to stuff fed primarily on grains. That I think if people had a better understanding, there would be more demand for meat grown purely on grass, and that therefore there would be a greater demand for hay and for these low intensity systems. So I think there's a lot that local groups can do, and I think what they need to do would probably differ site by site depending what their local context is, but there's a lot of potential for them to get involved.
Can I sneak on and be an extra panel member as well, and just give a little bit of a wider perspective, because we are we're involved with lots of community groups across the country. We've probably got about 30 different groups on my list, who are all involved in different ways in their local floodplain meadow. And as David said, it is horses for courses again. The community groups can be incredibly powerful campaigning organisations when they want to be. So, you sound like you've already done a bit of that with your planning and working with Matt at the Wildlife Trust. But they can also be very powerful fundraisers and engagement organisations. So looking for funds from a community group can access funds that statutory or non-statutory organisations might not be able to get to. So I think that's another niche thing that community groups can do. So if you want to talk more directly, Sammy, to me about what other community groups are doing, I can put you in touch with lots of other people, if that's of any help. Does that answer your question? Yeah, thank you. Okay. Well, a set of absolutely brilliant questions. We do have a fifth one which snuck on at the last minute, but I am also conscious of the time. So I'm tempted to say, shall we call it a day now, and I'll bring Kath on first thing tomorrow, because she said she can answer it first thing tomorrow as well, for that new question. But I also noticed there's a couple of hands. So if those hands relate to discussion that we've already been having and aren't new questions, should we see if we can unmute one of them, and maybe just have a couple of quick finish off questions? Who can I see? Anne Cantrell, you've got your hand up. Is it a...
Rosalind has just been upgraded, so Rosalind can
Okay.
unmute herself now.
Okay, hi Ros. Can you speak? Oh, she may be having trouble.
Sorry, actually, I would only really second Dan's question. Would traditionally managed floodplain meadow, I'm reading from the chat box, floodplain meadow landscapes have featured any trees? E.g. in infield trees, boundary trees, hedgerows, small pockets of woodland. Should we be aiming to recreate these as part of a habitat mosaic? Sorry, actually, I didn't really put my hand up. I didn't mean to, but I was looking at that and that's an interesting thought.
Right, okay. Well, thanks for that. Does anybody want to have a quick go at answering that question?
Willows and alders, I think they're an essential element of a floodplain meadow, and black poplar in our neck of the woods. So, yes.
I'll take one more from the panel. Matt, do you want to?
Yeah, I'd say absolutely. And it comes back to this idea of having a whole mosaic of different habitats. At the moment, we sort of restoration is often on a field scale, and it just is focused on a meadow. But we should be restoring it at a bigger scale and having a whole mosaic of wetland habitats within the floodplain. And yes, they would, trees and black poplars and everything would feature within that.
Thank you. Pollards, Elizabeth Cook has said. And in our history session on Friday morning, we will be looking at historic landscapes and seeing if we can tease out how these landscapes looked over the last 1,000 years. So let's just go for one more. Anne, have you got your hand up because you want to ask a question, or is it a legacy? Babette, can you unmute Anne, and let's see.
Yeah, Anne, you can unmute yourself now.
Yeah, thank you. I think you've sort of partly answered my question, really, Andy and Claire. It's directed to you more than anybody else. I'm interested in what's driven you to go down the route that you've gone down. Is it purely economic? Is it really about protecting the environment? What's driving you, and how can we influence more farmers to do what you're doing? Because it sounds absolutely fantastic.
Amazing. But did you say, was that to me, Emma? I thought I heard my name.
Yes, Claire and Andy, I think, for this one.
Okay. What motivated us? More frequent flooding and drought events was the main thing that made us realise that we needed to do something different. We've been organic for nearly 20 years, so technically we should be the best of the best farmers that are out there, but yet we're struggling with financially farming is tough. But aside from that, is dealing with the challenges that the climate changing is bringing us, and our water holding capacity of the farm. And it was after we'd had wettest winter on record ever, like it is every winter now, and then we had cracks in the ground in April for lambing. I was lambing and it was just cracks and there was no water in the ground and we were struggling for grass, and we've seen another drought spring this spring, wettest winter on record followed by drought springs, and that was lots of other factors, but that was more of a fundamental thing. Also, we weren't big input users, but when I speak to other farmers, it's that treadmill of inputs. That is one of the things that they speak about wanting to get off. We're reliant on a lot of stuff as farmers coming into the farm: seeds, fertilizer, treatments, lots of different things to try and control nature. Most of it's about control. When I learned to let go and learned to give up trying to control what was happening and understand what nature was trying to tell me, that's when my perspective changed, and also started to enjoy it a lot more. And so how do we get others? I think it's changing already. Farmers are recognizing things need to change. The payments removed over the next couple of years, as that starts to scale, will really change people, but we get inundated with people being interested. So I think the change is happening already.
Thank you, Claire. And Andy, one last thought on that?
Yeah, so we I guess we pursued direct selling due to the money side of it. Essentially £1,000 more margin per animal, but actually I agree with the resilience points. If you look at our neighbour's visit, which is arable on the other side of the riverbank, he's losing soil every other year and it's just not sustainable. How you get the farmers to do it, I think when the couple of billion disappears out of farmers' pockets over the next 3 years, that will make some people look up and think, but they've got to have the right skills. And a lot of farmers don't particularly want to deal with the public. So therefore, that could be interesting. So then they'll have to form partnerships and work with other people that do want to do the public facing bit. So I think it's going to be really interesting, but I do think the money side of it will assist some people to have to look at other ways of doing things. But yeah, also it's really interesting. The botany and the dynamic things are great, and having things like snake's head fritillaries lying around your house makes life a lot better.
Oh, a lovely note to finish on, Andy. Thank you very much. I should have brought my giant fritillary into the background. Maybe I'll do it for tomorrow. I think on that note, we're going to wrap up for now. But we're doing this all again tomorrow, and another Floodplain Meadows question time tomorrow evening. I already have 2 questions scheduled in for that. But if you want to be one of the official questions that's asked, can you please drop me an email, and I will try and put you on the list. And we will go through the chat and pick up any questions that have been asked in it and see if we can fit them in. I feel like this discussion could go on and on, actually. So it's an interesting format for us to have tried. And I'm thinking that maybe for our face-to-face conference next year, we might do something like this. Anyway, so that's it for today. Thank you so much for your attention. Thank you so much to our lovely panelists who've been so knowledgeable and very happy to share that knowledge. And thank you for all your questions. We'll meet again here tomorrow morning at 9:30 for a good morning on soil carbon. And hopefully, if Babette puts up the next slide, she's going to leave you with one of our pieces of artwork, which is a poem. Thank you all very much and have a good evening. Bye-bye.